Can your supply chain absorb 50% tariffs without ruining margins? Before the 2027 risk, counter 50% tariffs on $20 billion by mapping exposure, guarding margins, and dual sourcing now. The United States has enacted additional 50% statutory import tariffs targeting a designated $20 billion basket of Canadian products, creating immediate operational friction across interconnected cross-border manufacturing channels. This $20 billion tariff action directly touches roughly 2.3% of the broader $872.3 billion U.S.-Canada goods and services trade recorded across the 2025 financial year. Total bilateral commercial flows in 2025 comprised $381.9 billion in U.S. goods imports from Canada alongside $333.6 billion in American merchandise exports crossing the northern border. Focusing solely on the $20 billion headline figure overlooks how localized trade disputes can destabilize an expansive North American economic relationship approaching nearly $900 billion in annual volume. While a 50% tariff applies at the customs border, it does not translate into a direct 50% increase in final retail prices across consumer shelves. The financial burden of the 50% levy is shared across international supply chains, squeezing profit margins among foreign vendors, freight intermediaries, wholesale distributors, and domestic retailers. Under Section 338 statutory authority, import duties reaching up to 50% were levied across diverse products including fresh cut flowers, natural honey, wine, hockey sticks, and bulk cement. When you evaluate your balance sheet against these 50% import duties, you must model whether absorbing 5% to 15% margin cuts is safer than risking double-digit customer volume losses. Product diversity under Section 338 proves that substitution friction varies drastically, making uniform 3% or 5% corporate inflation projections inaccurate for multi-category enterprise planning. Sourcing perishables like fresh flowers faces strict logistical limits, whereas industrial components face multi-month technical qualification cycles that prevent fast substitution despite 50% import penalties. Canada responded by enacting reciprocal, dollar-for-dollar retaliatory tariffs scheduled to take effect on September 8 following the breakdown of bilateral trade negotiations between government representatives. The September 8 retaliatory package deliberately targets key American sectors, imposing counter-tariffs on U.S. steel shipments, consumer electronics, dairy exports, and commercial apparel. American companies exporting finished goods to Canadian buyers now face secondary cost pressures starting September 8, even if their specific product lines were excluded from the original $20 billion tariff. Economic scale does not eliminate cross-border vulnerability, as U.S. producers depend on Canadian supply for hundreds of millions of dollars in energy, critical minerals, and industrial subassemblies. The primary macroeconomic threat is the announced plan to impose a 50% tariff on Canadian passenger vehicles, commercial trucks, and automotive parts effective January 1, 2027. The impending January 1, 2027 automotive deadline threatens the core of regional manufacturing, where motor vehicle parts cross the U.S.-Canada border up to 7 or 8 times during production. To justify automotive duties, Washington cited a 22% drop in U.S. vehicle exports to Canada, which fell from $25.9 billion to $20.3 billion across comparable April to March reporting periods. Attributing the full $5.6 billion automotive export decline solely to Canadian trade policies overlooks broader macroeconomic cycles and consumer demand shifts across North American markets. The USMCA framework underpins approximately $2 trillion in trilateral goods and services trade, supporting tightly integrated supply networks across the United States, Canada, and Mexico. When you review component dependencies within the $2 trillion USMCA trade bloc, you must identify whether secondary suppliers rely on Canadian materials subject to the 50% tariff rate. Taxing imported inputs under a 50% border duty raises total production costs for domestic assembly plants, eroding their competitive pricing power in global export markets. Policy uncertainty functions as a hidden corporate tax, with historical trade shifts demonstrating how sudden border penalties suppress private capital investment by double-digit percentages. A predictable, permanent 20% tariff allows precise financial forecasting, whereas sudden shifts between 0% exemptions and 50% levies disrupt multi-year corporate capital budgeting. Enterprise advisory models from L-Impact Solutions emphasize that businesses must stress test 3 distinct scenarios before the January 1, 2027 deadline: full 50% tariffs, partial de-escalation, and expanded multi-sector retaliation. The first required corporate action is building an exposure matrix covering all Canadian supplier contracts, itemizing tariff rates, gross margin sensitivities, and annual procurement spend down to the dollar. Procurement managers must prioritize replaceability over gross spend. A minor vendor representing just 5% of annual budget can cause a 100% assembly shutdown if component replacement requires 12 months. When evaluating replacement timelines, components requiring 6 to 12 months for quality testing represent far higher operational risk than high-spend commodities with immediate 30-day substitutes. Corporate risk assessments designed by L-Impact Solutions convert geopolitical trade friction into measurable procurement roadmaps, helping leadership protect operating cash flows against escalating cross-border duties. Management teams should model 3 pricing scenarios: 0% pass-through, 50% partial pass-through, and 100% full pass-through, to evaluate exact impacts on gross margin, cash reserves, and unit volumes. Product lines must be segmented by price elasticity, identifying which specialized goods can absorb a 15% price adjustment and which elastic goods risk a 30% collapse in unit sales. Strategic diversification requires targeted redundancy rather than total reshoring, as replacing every Canadian supplier can increase baseline operational overhead by 15% to 25% prematurely. Procuring from non-Canadian suppliers fails to eliminate tariff risk if those secondary Tier 2 vendors depend on Canadian commodities or processing capacity for 40% or more of their production. Cross-border trade policymakers need explicit off-ramps linking 50% tariff rollbacks to verified regulatory milestones, restoring certainty across the $872.3 billion bilateral corridor. Canada's September 8 countermeasures demonstrate that aggressive bilateral tariffs often trigger proportional retaliation, creating compounding cost channels across both sides of the border. The White House Section 338 action illustrates that maximum tariff pressure can undermine domestic industrial strength by inflating intermediate input costs for American manufacturers. Sourcing teams should monitor whether bilateral negotiations before January 1, 2027 yield quota arrangements or exemptions for the $20.3 billion automotive export sector. Hedging against the 50% import levy requires finance departments to secure flexible, 90-day working capital credit lines to finance higher customs cash outlays at border ports of entry. Strategic cost planning shifts procurement focus from lowest piece price to lowest risk-adjusted landed cost, accounting for 50% duties, freight adjustments, and multi-month supplier lead times. The most resilient corporate strategy combines disciplined pass-through pricing with targeted dual sourcing across the $20 billion exposed import categories to safeguard operating margins. When you align your capital allocation against the January 1, 2027 deadline rather than short-term political rhetoric, your enterprise protects its share of the $872.3 billion North American trade corridor. For more analyses, visit our consultancy website. Link in description below. Thank you.